Hey everybody, welcome to the workshop. Welcome to week 2 of my Make Something Every Day in 2025 challenge. So this week I have a slightly different approach I want to take to it. Last week it was lots of individual bitty projects. This week I have a project that is made up of lots of little projects that I want to do. You'll see as we get into it. But to start with, I'm going to get my bench tidied because it's an absolute mess, and then we'll get into day 1. So someone once told me that the difference between collecting something and hoarding something was whether or not you display it. You can see me here getting out a load of toy cars. These are my toy cars from when I was a little kid. I recently reacquired them from my parents' house. One of the things that I figured I wanted to do was to be able to display things that were kind of important to me. And in this video, I took the approach that I could make some display cabinets to show of a whole variety of different things. Lots of little display cabinets, all eclectic and different cabinets. One of the themes though that you're going to see in this week's video is an annoyance with my tools and my workshop. You can see me here struggling with the miter saw. There's not enough room in the workshop. You can see it touching the end wall there. The other factor is this miter saw doesn't actually cut at whatever angle you set it to. You can spend a lot of time setting it up very, very carefully, but actually because of the materials it's made of, as you pull down on the cut, it flexes slightly and you end up with a cut going off at an angle. So I figured it was worth trying properly to start with here, so I'm doing the miter cuts using the miter saw, as the name would suggest, for the first frame that I'm making. All of these frames are going to have slightly different construction, but broadly speaking, they're all going to be pretty similar. I did work out that those miters were nowhere near right, so using my Triton sander and a speed square just to get me a nice straight edge there, I ended up resanding all of the joins. It ended up reprofiling them all to get to the 45. It's not really what this tool's designed for, it's not really the right way of doing it, but if your tools aren't doing the right thing, then sometimes you need to do that. This Triton, by the way, I mentioned in the last video, I feel like at the minute it is definitely one of the MVPs in my workshop. I use it in the majority of projects. So I know there's a lot of other versions out there as well, made by different companies, but it is a really good, really useful tool. One of the things that very much came to the forefront this week in my making was the fact that the tools can be one of the things that slows you down. So the example in this case is, I cut all of those miters. In theory, they should have been 45 degrees and I should have been straight on to the next step. But in practice, I then had to go back and resand all 8 miters back to the right profile. When I'm working in an environment where I don't have a lot of time, I'm trying to get projects done quickly in the bits of time that I can snatch from the rest of life, it is interesting to know how much the tools can cost you that time. And it doesn't mean you necessarily need to go out and buy the most expensive tools on the planet, but at the same time, it's worth noting, and I think I hadn't recognised before, how much those little things add up and can cost you time when you have got a limited amount to work with. I always find it really interesting when gluing up projects and watching other people glue up projects on YouTube. The number of times when people go, and then you have to wait 20 minutes for it to set. And realistically, it's that point that I know fine well that they're not also in Scotland in January. Glue here can take anything up to 12 to 14 hours to set realistically. This Gorilla Glue that I'm using, I find to be one of the fastest to set. But realistically, nothing sets particularly quickly unless I start bringing things into the house, but there's a limit to how many projects I can do that with. So that's day 1 of week 2 done, day 6 of the overall project. I didn't get as much done as I wanted to get done today. I think that might be an ongoing theme where I think I can do more than I can in the time that I've got available. But I've still got some bits and pieces to do on the editing for week 1's video, so I'm going to go spend the evening doing that. It's getting colder out here again. Yeah, you can see my breath this week. That'll make sense to any of you who've watched last week's video, which I'm not put out yet. That comes out in 2 days' time. It's all very confusing. Next steps, I guess, on this project, I need to wait for the glue to dry. At this temperature, that could take a while, so I might move it into my office or into the house where it's a bit warmer. Then I want to put some shelves in for the cars, get the whole thing sanded. and then move on to another box. So a bit more about the concept. The boxes aren't all going to be the same. They're going to be different depths. They're going to be different woods. The idea is it's not one continuous piece. It is a series of different pieces that make up the whole. So I need to have a look at some different woods, have a look at some ideas for the other boxes, the other frames. And the idea is this is something I can add to over time as I have more ideas and go out. It'd be nice to have a display case that shows that aspect of my life or whatever's going on. So yeah, day 1 of week 2 done. Starting to feel like there's maybe a bit of a flow to it, although to be honest in this weather it's still a challenge to get myself out here. On to day 2. Okay, so day 7 of the challenge. It is the 7th of January, so this is week 2, day 2 in terms of how I'm sorting it out. First thing to do is get the frame I made yesterday out the clamps, get some shelves in, and then I've got another frame that I want to get on with making, so let's crack on. So I guess a fairly valid question is why make a frame for some toy cars from when I was a kid? Partly, as I said, it'd be nice to display them somewhere rather than just have them sat in a box and not be looking at them at all. If I'm going to keep them, I might as well be doing something with them. I think all of us probably have toys that when you think back to being a child you remember playing with. These cars for me are one of those things. There are other items, but these are the ones that I have available to me easily to display. So they're a nice way of acknowledging how important they were to me at that time. There's certain cars in this collection that I have vivid memories of playing with, and those will definitely be ones that go into this frame. Although I may change them around from time to time, swap out which ones are in the display and which ones are packed away. So now we move on to the second tool to let me down this week. It feels like it's all the power tools. The bandsaw, as you can see here, is cutting fine. It can do with a new blade, but I'll get round to doing that. What I didn't realise at this point was that this was the last cut that the bandsaw was going to make before deciding that it was going on temporary strike. So it was my plan to resaw this piece of sycamore in half so as to give me two shelves that were the same size. But when I actually went to try and start the saw, you can see here, it kept trying to start and then just running itself down and stopping before it actually did anything. Right, so unfortunately, I've had to somewhat stop play because we're playing a game of my bandsaw stopped working. So when I switch it on, it runs, and then it just stops. And sometimes it doesn't even run. So that's great chat. What I'm going to have to start with is I'm going to clean it all up. I'm going to take this switch housing off, see if there's something there, but I guess today's making might actually be repairing. I've had this bandsaw for a good 5 or so years. It was the most expensive one to start with. It's from the hobby range from Axminster, so there's a limit to what I'm expecting it to be capable of, if I'm honest, based on the amount of money that it cost me. But it would be nice if it didn't just stop working entirely. The fact that the motor spins up a bit tells me that there is a connection, that the motor is still functioning, it's not locked up. By the way, blowing this out like this was a complete mistake. I covered myself and everything else in dust. But the first thing to try, having unplugged it, really have to emphasise that that's important, was to try just cleaning out the connections, making sure all the connectors are seated correctly. Quite often with things, especially in an environment like the workshop, it turns out to just be a question of they're so clogged up with dust they need to clean. I haven't been into the internals of this in several years, so as you can see, quite a lot of dust. Get the compressed air on there, clean it up. It is amazing how many times actually just cleaning something can actually fix the problem. Again though, it'd be easy to get into the conversation about whether this is a question of the quality of the tool, meaning that I'm getting less done, or whether this is something that would be a problem with every tool. Realistically, any tool not properly maintained, not looked after, not cleaned is never going to be completely reliable, and that's perfectly fair. Why should it be? Right, moment of truth. Has cleaning it solved the problem? Not if I don't plug it back in. Yes. Okay, so it is day 8 of the overall project, day 3 of week 2. Does that make any sense? Makes sense to me. I think I'm just going to start referring to it as the day of the overall project, because that makes a lot more sense. Day 8, and I have come out to the workshop, and it is still cold, because it's Scotland. Of course it's cold. It's cold enough that we've got a hoodie on today. But let's crack on, and VoiceOver Neil will explain what's going on. So, VoiceOver Neil would like to have a chat with past Neil about why he's not doing proper intros and expecting me to cover it all. But anyway, we're back to the plan before the bandsaw broke, which is to resaw this piece in half so as to give us the 2 shelves. I think it'll look nice having the wood thinner against the thicker frame on the outside. Trying to be a bit careful here because I don't want to overload the bandsaw. Reality is, I don't quite know what fixed it. I cleaned it and it started working again. In some ways, that's a good thing because it meant it didn't cost me a lot. I wasn't suddenly without the bandsaw or anything. But I always feel slightly off when I don't quite know how I fixed the problem. There wasn't a very obvious connector that was loose or a very obvious bit of dirt blocking a connection somewhere. On the topic of tools though, what I will say is this sander, which I bought fairly cheaply, it's a JCB brand one. I bought this sander, I want to say it was probably about 8 years ago now, and it's been absolutely rock solid. So I can't complain about all my tools. In fact, I don't want to complain about all my tools because I'm very lucky to have the tools I have. But I did want to mention that with tools that rely on consumables, so I guess, for example, sanders relying on sandpaper, to an extent, bandsaws relying on blades, actually what I'm discovering as I go is that the consumable itself is almost more important in dictating the performance of the tool than the brand of the tool itself. Obviously, reliability is another thing, and that can be different between different brands and can be a bit unpredictable. But in terms of that sander, I can't complain about it at all. I spend a bit more on sandpaper than I could. I could probably get some cheaper, but with some decent sandpaper, can't fault that sander in the slightest. So, tools may have been annoying me this week, but in reality, they're not all annoying. I just need to find the right ones and stick with them. Right, so it comes to the time of doing the very important measurements. I could use a tape measure, but realistically, I know what I want to go on the bottom shelf, which is this with a car on top. So that kind of gives me the definition of where the bottom shelf needs to go in. Let's have a little look. So bottom shelf needs tapped into place, but I don't want to do that until I've got the glue on it. There we go. It's going to go somewhere around there, although it needs squared up, obviously. And then I want this shelf to basically split the difference on this top piece here. So shelves are going to go approximately like that. I was talking about glue earlier and waiting a long time for it to dry. Obviously that applies mainly to things like wood glue. For these shelves, because they were incredibly light, I took the approach of just using some CA glue, super glue, whatever you want to call it, and using some kicker spray, which sets it almost instantly. This isn't a glue that's going to have a particularly high strength to it, but realistically, I'm looking at maybe getting 3 or 4 cars on each of these shelves. They're not going to take an awful lot of weight. So this is the start of day 9, and you can probably tell by the fact I didn't film an intro and I just went and got on with it. This is the first day when I really didn't feel like going out to the garage and getting on with making something. This is where maybe in the future I need to be thinking about makes that don't involve me doing woodwork, being in the cold, being in the garage or whatever. But I started this day doing another frame. This frame has a slightly different purpose, slightly different feel to it, but the amount of talking to the camera is well, non-existent. And yeah, it was a day in which I had to actually make myself get on with it. So what I should have said in an intro to this is that I'm making another frame today. This one's slightly different. The idea behind this one is to showcase some pictures. For a large section of my life, from when I was about 14 until 2020, I was heavily involved in the events industry. It's what I did for a living for a long time. And I was privileged enough to be involved in all sorts of incredible events. There was theatre, there was sporting events, there was corporate events, there was music, all sorts of different things. And it's a section of my life that it's quite difficult to have something to display, because obviously those events were all one-off things, but photos is the one thing that I do have lots of. So I was trying to think of how I could do this, and I decided that actually maybe creating a frame that could be a small gallery where from time to time I can change the pictures, but I can include pictures that show events that meant something to me, events I was proud of, whatever, but could showcase that aspect of my life that was a significant portion of what I was doing for more years than I care to admit. As a day of making, though, I have to admit this was definitely a difficult one. Low on motivation, as I said, and low on the attention to detail. There's just things where it's just not the standard I would want to do things to a lot of the time. Yesterday was just a bit rubbish. I rushed it, didn't have very much time, was trying to get the project done, which has never been the point, and I don't quite know why I focused on that, but I guess that feeling of having to get a certain amount of stuff done. So I need to have a relook at what I was doing yesterday. It kind of throws out the window the idea of getting all of them done this week. That combined with doing the bandsaw fix earlier on in the week, which was just cleaning but took up a chunk of my time. The narrative continues. I think we're going to have to call this challenge Neil Expects to Get More Done Than He Can. Which is maybe something I need to bear in mind. I've said that a few times now. I should start actually doing that. But anyway, for now, I'm going to clean up what I worked on yesterday. And I've got an idea for a finish on the wood, just to make it a bit more interesting, make it stand out a bit from the other boxes that I've done. So looking back through my diary and seeing what was happening when, trying to work out why I was just a bit down the day before and not really working the way I want to. I think one of the factors was I had released the first video in this series and it was not performing the way I had hoped it would perform. I think that's always the case with YouTube videos. It's a complete mystery. I mean, there's people out there who tell you they understand how to hack the algorithm and all sorts like that. I think there's just times when sometimes videos do well and sometimes they don't. There's definitely things you can do that help, but I think putting too much thought into it can lead you down mind pathways that don't actually get you anywhere. I think on day 10 though, this day that you're watching just now, I maybe had a little bit more patience because I became aware that on day 11 I was going to have a bit more time, which was quite nice. I think, again, as I mentioned, I'd overestimated how much I could do. It felt a bit pressured to be 4 or 5 days in and not have 4 or 5 frames. I think originally in my plan when I wrote it out in a notebook, I'd come up with the idea that I was going to be able to make a frame a day, and then the last day would be me hanging them in my office and putting items in them. That just wasn't the way it worked out. That's fair enough, it's not a major issue, but I think on day 9 I was feeling a bit down about that, combination of not getting through it as fast as I wanted, previous video not performing as well, let myself get in my head a bit. So on this day, tried to relax. I figured I might as well burn the wood. It's a nice little feature, it makes it very different to the previous frame. It's quite therapeutic, it warms the workshop up a fair bit, and it just gave me something to focus on and to feel like I was making some interesting progression with the work. I feel like events is an interesting one to include in this maker project because a lot of the design work I was doing involved making of pieces of set, or involved making props, or designing systems to solve problems to enable creative things to happen, which I think speaks a lot into my maker journey. I enjoy making things that solve a problem. I quite enjoy making tools. You may have seen in some of my other videos. I tend to be less about making things just for the aesthetic, which I appreciate. Is a bit ironic to say whilst making a frame that is going to be used as a gallery, but it did give me time to think interestingly about where my making comes from, where the inputs have been to my making and my skills and what I've developed over time. Hey folks, it is the 11th of January. I have a bit more time today than I have the rest of the week, which is quite nice. I've got a couple of bits I want to do, so I'm going to get another frame built and I'll talk about that whilst you watch me build it. And then my intention is to get them all hung, get the bits and pieces into the frames. I'm going to end up with 3 frames at this stage. I was kind of hoping to have done about 5, but as we talked about earlier in the week, time is a thing that just kind of happens. So 3 for now. It's a project I can add to as and when I want to as I go through it. But for today, let's crack on and make the best use of the time. So this final frame that I'm making for the week, I'm making out of some larch, which is left over from when I clad the outside of my office that I built for myself. This frame's going to be a slightly different one to the others, in that each of the other 2 frames that I've made have been for a specific thing. This frame is going to house a couple of different things. It may be down the line that actually I split the things out, make another frame and split things between them. But in essence, this frame is going to hold things from people who are makers, so where people have made things for me, but it's also going to hold things from my grandfather. My grandfather was very important to me, and one of my favourite memories from when I was little, many of my favourite memories, involved sitting in his workshop, whether that was his commercial space that he had in Aberdour, where you could see the seals, or whether that was the workshop that he had in his garage. My grandfather was a watch and clock repairman. He used to fix grandfather clocks, but he also used to do watches and pocket watches and things like that. For me as a kid, his workshop was a fascinating place. There was all sorts of tiny things and big things and tools, and there was also a drawer in his desk where magically there were always cupcakes that my grandmother had baked. I suspect that only happened on times when they knew I was going to the workshop. But at my age, when I was little, as far as I was concerned, he had a cupcake drawer in his desk, which is a fantastic thing. So I have a few items from my grandfather that I want to display. I think his influence and the time I spent going to the workshop with him definitely played into me getting involved in making. And more recently, when he passed away, I inherited his wood lathe. That's actually what started me turning. I'd never turned wood before that, so I taught myself, but on the lathe that he used to use. So he is very important to me in terms of my making and just in generally, so I would like to honour him as part of this display, put a few things in that remind me of him and things that are important. We do, however, have to get back to the fact that this week is the week of my tools failing on me, and the next one that failed on me was my phone, which I'm using to record all of this video. As you can see, I lost some footage. So what you're missing, what you didn't see, was me gluing up this board. It is essentially 3 pieces of the same larch, measured to the same size as the back, glued together, clamped and left to set up. So I guess I don't have an awful lot to say about putting this frame together, as it's very similar to the first frame I did, the one that I did for the cars. The boards themselves had quite a lot of cup in them, so I'm using the sander here, both to get any glue squeeze out off, to smooth over the joints, but also just to take some of that cupping out. It was always going to be a slightly more rustic box, and I'm very much okay with that. Whilst we watch me do this, I do want to take the opportunity to say thank you to those of you who've reached out after the first video in this series, who've expressed that you enjoy the new format. It's a bit weird for me because this is slightly different to just doing a straight up project video. So great to hear the feedback on that. Any other feedback you've got, please chuck it in the comments below or reach out to me on Instagram. I'd love to hear your input on the challenge I'm doing and any ideas you've got for projects and the like. One of the best things that I've found since I started doing woodwork and sharing it online is the maker community, and I do want to say that I'm massively grateful to all of my friends who are makers, all of the people who post their work, the good, the bad, their mistakes and everything, because it's really helpful. It inspires me to try new stuff and to be okay with getting some stuff wrong. So massive thank you to everybody in the maker community. That's partly why this frame will house things that people have made for me that I've got from makers, because they are a significant part of my world and what I do these days, and having other people make things and to be able to hold and to use things made by other people can be really inspiring whilst you're trying to come up with your own ideas. So, welcome to the office. This is where I do all my video editing. It's also where I do my day job. It's a little space. It's only 10 foot by 6 foot. Ceiling height is quite low, especially at 6'3". However, I have this space on the wall here, and this is where I'm going to mount the frames. Initially just the 3, and then I can expand it out and keep adding frames. So, let's focus on getting them mounted. One of the major advantages of having used the panels of wood for the wall is the fact that there are some nice straight lines, so levelling everything up is relatively easy. Turns out it's not quite entirely level, but it is level to the eye because of the lines, and I think if I was to level it to a bubble, it might actually look slightly off. When I built the office, I built it with wooden walls, and then it's actually flooring material I've used for the wall cover here in front of it, but what that means is I can just screw in wherever I need to screw in. Positioning the frames was quite an interesting one. I wanted it to appear somewhat random and jigsawed together, but it's often actually really difficult to deliberately do something randomly. The minute you deliberately do anything, you lose that random element of it. So this is the frame where I wanted to put up the pictures of the event. So double-sided tape in there. This is a product called Tessa tape, which I really like. It's insanely strong, good tape, not sponsored in any way. And then what I've done is printed out pictures of some of the events that I can stick in there. This means I can take the paper out, I can put different ones in whenever I want to. With the cars, it then became a question of, okay, well, which ones actually go in here? Because they're not all going to fit. But I think that's a good thing. I think sometimes if we put some limitations in, it means you properly think about it and make decisions. So there's a series of cars here. The one top left that I've just put in there is one that I have very strong memories of playing with when I was little, along with the car transporter on the bottom. The Land Rover, those of you who know me, I love my Land Rovers. I have a Discovery 3, so obviously the Land Rover has to go in there. And then the little Skip Lorry, again, I remember playing with that one for a very long time. Some of the others, just ones that I remember. So for this frame, the bottom shelf is going to be things from my granddad. Some of these are just workshop things, so the little box on the right contains tiny little glass test tubes full of the most microscopic screws you've ever seen. The blue box in the middle is clock springs, which are really interesting to me. And then there's a pocket watch that he gave me, which means a lot and holds a lot of sentimental value. On the top shelf, I have a very small little blacksmith knife that Steve at Moonshine Metalworks made for me, which I'm really happy with, really love that little knife. I also have a coffee scoop, and I have a small bust of myself made for me by Duncan at Little Hobby Shop. So that's going in there as well. I've got loads more stuff that could go on these shelves, and as I say, over time I may well split this out into 2 separate shelves. I guess all that's left to say is thank you so much for joining me this week. Thank you for watching through the video, and thank you for following along with the series. If you're not subscribed, hit the subscribe button. If you haven't hit the like button, click the like button. All of it helps me push the videos out to more and more people. And on that note, I will see you next week for week 3.